all about the crochet. I'll put you in the know. Welcome, welcome, welcome to the Jayda InStitches show. Yay!
Hey everybody! Welcome to the Jayda InStitches show. I get asked this question all the time. How big do I have to make my granny squares? And how many do I need in order to make a regular sized blanket? Well, there's a lot that goes into that question. So let's unpack all of the elements that make up this query. In order to answer this question for yourself, you're going to need a few things. You're going to need a pen and a pad of paper because you're going to have to make some notes. You're going to need a calculator, and you're going to need a measuring tape. How big is a regular sized blanket? Well, that depends. Do you mean throw, something you can cuddle up with on the couch? A baby blanket, something you maybe want to give as a gift? Do you mean a twin-sized, a double, a queen, or a king? Well, just so happens I have the average sizes of those blanket shapes right here. Okay, now you've decided on the size of the blanket you want to make. Now you need your granny squares. This is where a little bit of math comes into play. My best advice is to make the granny square that you like. You can make it 5 rows or 3 rows or 4 rows. You can use whatever colors you want. Make the granny square that you like and then measure it. Once you've decided on the size and the number of rows and all the color patterning that you like for your granny square, take your completed granny square, put it down in front of you, grab your measuring tape, and measure it from one corner to the other. This is a 6-inch squared granny. Once you have that number, take your pen and paper and write it down. Granny square equals 6 inches squared. Now that you've measured your granny square and you've written that down, time for the calculator. Write down the size of the blanket that you've decided on. So I'm making a blanket that's 60 inches by 80 inches. What does that mean? 60 inches are the short sides. 80 inches are the long sides. It looks something like this. This is 60 inches going this way, and this is 80 inches going this way. Take the short side first, enter that number into your calculator, 60 inches. Now divide it by the size of your granny square, 6. Oops. 60 divided by 6 equals 10. I know that I need 10 granny squares up and down the side of my short side blanket. Now you do the same thing. Take the long side measurement, 80, divide it by 6 inches, or the size of your granny square, and you might get a fractional number. That doesn't matter. Take the closest one. So since it's a 0.3, I'm going to round down. So 13 is the number that I want alongside the long side of my blanket. So now I know that my blanket will be 13 squares by 10 squares. Remember, you will probably be putting on a border, and that extra couple of inches that your border gives you will beef up your blanket to the approximate size of the sort of blanket you're going for. You don't have to err on the side of too many squares. You can always err on the side of a couple too few, and I'll tell you why. When you join all your squares together, no matter how you decide to do it, whether you stitch them together or sew them together, there's going to be a little stretch. And that stretch will happen because the weight of the blanket on itself will pull your little squares out a little bit. And it'll be even, so don't worry about it. But that stretch is going to give you a little more length and a little more width. And like I said, when you put the border on, you're going to have a little more length and a little more width across the top, bottom, and the sides. So your blanket may not be exactly 60 inches by 80 inches, but it'll be close to that. And if you're making it to cover a bed, then you can always go a little long if you want, to go from floor to floor. But most of the time, these sorts of afghans are folded up or folded in half and draped across the edge of a bed, or if you're just using them to sleep, just make it sure that it's long enough for someone to get underneath and stay warm. So remember, choose the size of the blanket you want to make first, write down your measurements, make the square of your choice, measure it, write down those measurements, and then take the long and the short sides of the blanket, divide each of them by the same size of the square, and that will give you how many squares wide and how many squares long you need your blanket to be. So if it's 10 by 13 or 2 by 6, you know exactly how many squares long and how many squares deep you need them to be. And remember, there's one more math step to this. So if you have a blanket that's 10 squares by 5 squares, I guess that would be 5 by 10, multiply those two numbers together. 5 times 10 is 50. You will need 50 squares to make a blanket that size. If you need a blanket for a baby and the size of your square winds up that you only need it to be 3 squares by 6 squares, take 3 times 6, that's 18. You'll need 18 squares to make that blanket. Here's how it looks on paper. So once again, how many squares do I need? Well, in my little diagram, I figured that I needed 10 up by 13 long. So I take 10 as the width times 13, which is the length. Grab my calculator. 10 times 13 equals 130. I will need 130 squares at the 6-inch mark that I made to make this great big blanket here. Now obviously, if your squares are much bigger, you will not need as many of them. That's why it's a really good idea to go through this little math program to figure out exactly how many squares you need for your blanket. And there you go! That is how you figure out the size of the blanket you want to make and the number of granny squares you need in order to make that blanket. That's it for this week, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in. And if you have questions about crochet projects that you might be in the middle of, or you're possibly getting ready to do, leave them in the comment box down below. I read all the comments and I will take them all into consideration for future mini tutorials on the Jayda InStitches show. Thank you so much for tuning in. We will see you again really soon. Bye, everybody.
It's all about the crochet. I'll put you in the know. Welcome, welcome, welcome to